Hello everybody who's listening. Welcome to this podcast exploring worship, which is translated in French Explorons la louange. I'm elishamheman, and it's an honor and a joy to share with you this episode. As guest we have Rose Terrero from Dominican Republic. She is a passionate worship leader and a missionary. She is also known for her contribution in the album Flaming Arrows. So without further ado, welcome Rose.
Hello, my name is Rose Terrero, and to introduce myself just a little bit and how I met Jesus, I currently live in the Dominican Republic, working as a missionary with my husband. My husband is Dominican, but I am an American. I lived here in country before we met and got married, and before living in the Dominican Republic, I actually also lived in Guatemala. So my worship leading experience comes from the church I was a part of in Guatemala, and now the church I'm currently a part of here in the Dominican Republic. I came to know Jesus just through, I grew up knowing all the Bible stories and learning about Christ. My parents were formerly Amish, which is in the United States, it's a legalistic, works-based form of Christianity, and they maintain a completely different lifestyle and separate culture. But my parents left that to pursue the call of God in their lives to do overseas missions when I was around 6 years old. So I grew up with a good example of what it means to dedicate your life to Jesus, to the calling that He has. And when I was 7 years old, I gave my life to Christ personally and began my own journey with God.
What is your definition of worship?
Worship is a lifestyle. Biblically, it is defined as the expression of reverence and adoration of God in everything we do, through daily life, how we speak, how we treat others, and how we glorify God. For example, in Romans 12, verse 1, it says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. So that's what the actual definition of worship is biblically. In music, worship specifically refers to songs that express what daily worshiping God with our lives means. So it's like putting our daily worship into words through song is what the music version of worship would be.
What is the difference between praise and worship?
Praise, as I understand it, is worship specifically with words and music. Worship is to be poured out in everything we do and how we live, whereas praise is glorifying God through our words and often with music.
Who is your favorite worship leader and song?
It's a little bit difficult for me to pick out a favorite. Like, for example, our current pastor was formerly a worship leader and before he became a lead pastor, and I absolutely still love listening to him lead music in our church and lead the praise and worship time. When it comes to maybe some recognized artists, right now I really love City of Light and Sovereign Grace music. They have Sovereign Grace music has some songs in English and in Spanish. City of Light right now is mostly in English, all in English that I know of. The song that comes to mind is Christ in Me, which talks about how getting that I, but through Christ in me. That's probably a favorite song right now. But yeah, it's a little difficult to answer that one. It changes in seasons.
What was a trigger to your ministry?
God really clearly called me to ministry when I was really young, when I was around 12 years old. I just remember God touching my heart through someone else's testimony in their ministry. So that's really when I think developed a love for ministry full-time, a passion, a heart for ministry full-time, I should say. Now, music in itself has always been a part of my life. It's just part of the big picture of my life of ministry. Some periods in my ministry life, music has been one of the main things. And in other periods, God has actually asked me to put that on hold in order to focus on other areas of ministry He directs me to. And for about 5 years, I actually didn't do a lot of music ministry. I didn't have a piano, and I had a guitar, but didn't have a lot of time to practice guitar. And piano is my instrument of choice for worship music. So there have been seasons that I haven't done a lot. So, and then there's other seasons, such as the one I'm currently in, where I help with music every Sunday at our church. So yeah, it definitely goes through seasons in the music part.
What is the best way to introduce a new song to your congregation?
I personally think the best way to introduce a new song is first to several people and then to larger groups. So for example, it could obviously first be with the music team or the worship team, and then to maybe a small group setting, and then maybe to the rest of the congregation. But this definitely depends on how big your congregation is. With many times, it is important to know what the testimony of the song is and how the song glorifies God biblically. It's important to know that before you introduce it to the large group, so it's good to get some feedback from a smaller group. However, if you're confident that this really is one that is a biblically accurate song, one that glorifies God and draws our hearts closer to Jesus, then if it's an easier one to pick up, then it's easier to introduce to a large group. It is good to always get feedback before introducing a new song to a larger group. Especially if your congregation is very large. I think it's important that people know it to teach it to many people. However, if the congregation is very small, then it's easier to just learn a new song together.
What do you do if the audience is not responding to a song?
So this is where I think it's really important to get back to what the heart of worship is, which the heart of worship is to glorify God. With music, if an audience doesn't respond the way you personally desire, check to see if the song is truly glorifying God. Because that's the point of worship, is always to keep God first. If God is being glorified, but the audience doesn't understand the meaning or testimony of the song, then maybe that's the time to take more time with the introduction of the song before reintroducing it again. So maybe instead of teaching it to a large congregation, maybe take a step back and teach it to a few people first instead of just jumping into on a large scale. This kind of goes in with answer to the question before, where it's important to gauge how to introduce a new song.
What is the thing you wished you knew when you started?
What I wish I had known when I first started as a worship leader in a church, I'm specifically thinking of the one I was very actively involved in was Guatemala. I definitely wish I would have known from the beginning that emotions are not the goal of leading a worship or praise session. The goal is to glorify Jesus Christ. And I had a tendency to look for emotions a lot in the beginning, whereas now it's a lot easier for me just to worship out of my heart because I'm glorifying God.
Do you think rehearsals are important? How much time do you spend in rehearsal with your team per month and your personal practice?
I definitely think the answer to these questions depends on where your position is, what kind of congregation you're leading, what part on the music team that you play. Like I said, I went through a period for 5 years. I barely played music just because of where God had us in our other ministry avenues at the time. Now that I am back and helping with worship on every week again, I do by myself practice several times a week. I'm the piano player for our church right now, but I don't necessarily lead the music times or the worship sessions. We're a very small church, so we actually don't get to rehearse together a lot. There's only about 3 of us right now. We usually just rehearse on our own and practice on our own. We have the same list of songs that we practice together, and then when we come together on Sundays, then we are prepared to play together. However, I do wish we would get a time to rehearse together at least once a week. I think ideally, even if everybody is individually practicing separately a couple times a week, ideally it is good to rehearse together once a week at least. And again, this just depends, I think, on the setting. Is it a full-time job? Is this the job that you are being contracted to do? Or is it just something that you're, part of the body of Christ and you happen to have a skill and an ability that you want to use to worship God, and it's just a small, intimate congregation, so maybe it doesn't need as much practice. I do think at the end of it all, it is important to do it, whatever you are doing, to do it well, because you are doing it for the Lord.
What book have been most significant to you as a worship leader?
The Ragamuffin Gospel has been important to me as a believer, as a Jesus follower. It doesn't speak about music, but it speaks about our lives with Christ. This is the book that helped my perspective to become worship is everything we do, instead of only worship with music in church. And to understand that the results of our relationship with Jesus Christ flow over into our music. So I know there are other books on specific being worship leaders that can be helpful, but for me, it is very important to come back to the heart of the gospel and why we are doing what we're doing and where our hearts are and our relationships with Jesus Christ.
What change did you observe these last 20 years concerning the style of praise and worship?
Very sadly for me, a lot of changes that I see have to do with the music, and the words are becoming more shallow, and the goals of worship are to more emotionally attract people instead of the goal being to fully glorify Christ. I think some of the older songs have more depth in them, but this is also why the artists that I mentioned before, the reason I love their music is even though they are new, they have a lot of depth. So I think these changes are being recognized, and there's more new music being created that is more biblically solid and more Jesus-centered again.
What is your advice for worship leaders?
So my biggest piece of advice I have for any worship leader, and really anybody who is working in ministry, is to focus on Christ. Jesus Christ is the reason for everything we do. He is our calling. He is what will truly show us his worth of being worshiped. So the more we know Jesus, the more we worship him, and the more we will reflect him and his glory.
Do the melody and the changes of chord in a song put more emphasis on the words of a song?
Yes, I really truly believe this. Melody is the vehicle used to deliver the message of a song. The words are the message, and melody is like the vehicle. The same words can be spoken and not be remembered as long as when they are sung to music. So melody definitely does have an important part to play.
What's your best advice for someone who wants to join the worship team?
My best advice is to remember that you are only pointing people to Jesus Christ. You are here to glorify him and not yourself. And this comes with a challenge to daily examine your heart and long to know Christ more every single day. Again, the more we know Christ, the more we will live our lives as in worship of him.
How would you encourage those who have abandoned their worship ministry?
This is an interesting question, because it would depend on if this person has actually abandoned their ministry, or maybe sometimes God just has them in a different season. So for everyone, I would offer the same advice, which is for everyone, the advice I would offer is Colossians 4:17. Be sure to carry out the ministry the Lord gave you. So even if that isn't in worship but in something else, remember you are here for the Lord. So be sure you're carrying it out the way or what he has given you to do.
Well, I hope you have been encouraged with Rose's experience in worship. If you want to know more about our guests, please find the links below. Thanks for having time to listen to this podcast. If you like, don't hesitate to share with your friends and leave a message below. Be blessed and see you soon.